Sleep is a quiet country. We all seek its borders. The weight of the day begins to dissolve now. Imagine the city of Denver in the late autumn of 1941, where the air is crisp and the streets are lined with modest brick houses. The windows glow with a warm, amber light tonight. You are safe here. Beyond the glass, the rain falls in a steady, rhythmic pattern that washes away the noise of the modern world. We are traveling back to a world of shadows and secrets, to a house on West Moncrief Place where a story was quietly unfolding. It is a story of a man who lived in the spaces between the walls, a man who sought a solitude that the world refused to give him. I know you are tired. The hours have been long, and the mind is often the last part of us to find rest. Before we step onto the porch of that brick house, I want you to find your most comfortable position. Adjust the pillows so your neck is supported. Pull the heavy wool of the blanket up to your chin. Let the sound of the rain become the only clock you follow. A silver metronome marking the passage of a night that belongs entirely to you. We are going back to a time of coal smoke and radio plays. A time when the world felt both larger and more intimate. We tell these stories not to startle the heart, but to offer the mind a place to wander until it finds the door to sleep. Every story we share tonight has an ending. Every mystery has been solved by the passage of time. You can rest in the knowledge that there are no open loops here, no lingering questions. The order of the world has been restored. The air in Denver in 1941 carried the scent of the coming winter, a sharp, clean smell that promised snow. On West Moncrief Place, the houses stood like silent sentinels, their gardens resting under a thin layer of frost. It was a neighborhood of routines, of milk bottles left on porches and the distant clatter of the evening news. But inside one of these houses, a secret was taking root in the darkness of the ceiling. We will explore the life of Theodore Coneys, a man who became a ghost while he was still breathing. We will walk through the halls of Alcatraz with a man named Jim Quillen, finding a different kind of freedom behind iron bars. We will stand on a bridge in Pennsylvania with Jimmy Pasta, a man whose bravery was rewarded with a watch that refused to tick. Each of these lives is a thread in the tapestry of the 1940s. And tonight, we will follow those threads until they lead us to the stillness of the present. Let the rhythm of my voice carry you. Let the details of the past settle around you like a soft, gray mist. We begin our journey on a quiet residential street where the silence was about to be shared by an uninvited guest. To understand the man they would later call the Spider-Man, we must look back to a small town in Illinois in the year 1882. Theodore Coneys was born into a world of hard edges and industrial iron. His father, T.H. Coneys, was a Canadian immigrant who owned a hardware store in Petersburg. Imagine the interior of that store. The heavy scent of machine oil, the cold touch of steel bolts, the rough texture of unplaned wood. It was a place of utility and strength. But Theodore was not a creature of strength. He was a frail child, a boy whose lungs seemed too small for the air of the plains. When his father passed away in 1888, the world became even quieter for young Theodore. He was only 6 years old, left in a world that demanded a robustness he did not possess. He and his mother moved from the hardware store to a farm near Beloit, Wisconsin, seeking perhaps the healing power of the open air. Theodore was a man who lived in the in-between, he was a bookkeeper by trade, a man of ledgers, ink, and columns of figures that always had to balance. But his own life never felt balanced. Doctors told him early on that his heart and lungs were weak. They gave him a prognosis that would haunt his every step. They told him he wouldn't see his 18th birthday. When you are told your time is finite before you have even begun to live, the world takes on a different hue. You begin to look for corners to hide in. You look for places where the judgment of the healthy cannot reach you. Theodore grew to resent the pity he saw in the eyes of neighbors. He felt the weight of being a medical marvel who was always on the verge of vanishing. He wanted a place where he could be alone, free from the exhaustion of being seen, free from the social obligation of appearing well. In 1907, Theodore and his mother moved to Denver. They were drawn by the promises of the dry mountain air, a common prescription for those with respiratory ailments in the early 20th century. His mother found work as a housekeeper at the Denver Democratic Club, a place of mahogany tables and political whispers. Theodore continued his work with numbers, but the city was a lonely place for a man of his temperament. When his mother died in 1911, the last anchor of his life was cut loose. He spent the next 30 years drifting. He worked in advertising and sales, moving through the world like a shadow. By 1941, Theodore was 59 years old. He had outlived the doctor's predictions by 4 decades, but the victory felt hollow. He was homeless, a ghost in a suit, walking the streets of Denver as the world prepared for the Great War. He remembered an old acquaintance, a man named Philip Peters. Philip lived at 3335 West Moncrief Place. It was a solid brick house, a place of routine and comfort that Theodore had visited years before. Theodore didn't go there with malice in his heart. He went there looking for a handout, perhaps a bit of food or a moment of warmth away from the autumn wind. But when he arrived in September, the house was silent. Philip was away. Theodore found a way inside, his boots making no sound on the polished floorboards. He stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and old newspapers. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for a way in. He began to explore the architecture of the house, looking for a place where a man of his small stature could finally disappear. Inside the house on Moncrief Place, Theodore found a closet. It was an ordinary closet, tucked away in a corner of the second floor, smelling of cedar and the faint, sweet scent of old wool. It was a space designed for storage, for things the world no longer needed to see. But when Theodore looked up, he saw a small trapdoor in the ceiling. It was barely large enough for a man to fit through, a square of wood that blended into the shadows. Theodore was a small man, his frame thinned by years of illness and the meager rations of a life on the streets. He reached up, pushed the door open, and felt the cool, stagnant air of the attic brush against his face. He pulled himself up, his muscles straining in the dark, and disappeared into the eaves of the roof. What he found was not a room, but a cubbyhole. It was a narrow, cramped space beneath the slope of the roof, where the rafters met the floorboards in a sharp angle. It was dusty, the air thick with the smell of dry wood and decades of settled soot. The only light came from thin cracks in the shingles, casting long, needle-like beams across the insulation. To a normal man, it would have been a tomb. To Theodore, it was a sanctuary. For 5 weeks, He lived in that darkness while Philip Peters was away. He became a creature of the house's rhythm, a silent partner in the architecture. When the sun was high and the street was busy, Theodore lay perfectly still on the rafters. He listened to the house breathe. He heard the settling of the foundation, the whistle of the wind against the chimney, and the distant muffled hum of the Denver traffic. Imagine the patience required to live in a space where you cannot stand fully upright. Theodore lay on his side, his head resting on a bundle of old rags he had found. He became attuned to the smallest sounds. He knew the scratch of a squirrel on the roof and the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway below. When hunger became a dull ache, he would lower himself from the ceiling with the grace of a ghost. He moved through the kitchen with practiced silence, taking only small amounts of food, a crust of bread, a single spoonful of jam, a few crackers from a tin. He was careful to never take enough to be missed. He drank water from the tap, the sound of the pipes echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet afternoon. He would sit at Philip's table and read the newspapers, keeping track of a world he no longer belonged to, before retreating back to his wooden cocoon before the shadows grew too long. In that attic, Theodore felt a strange sense of belonging. It was a parasitic peace, a way to exist without the burden of being a man in society. He was no longer the frail bookkeeper or the homeless wanderer. He was a secret kept by the house itself. He watched the seasons change through the cracks in the wood, seeing the gold of September turn into the gray of October. He felt the temperature drop, the wood of the rafters becoming cold to the touch. He wrapped himself in discarded clothes and waited. He was a man who had finally found the solitude he had been promised by his own frailty. He was simply a shadow in the ceiling, waiting for the sun to go down so he could reclaim the kitchen for another hour of borrowed life. The peace of the attic was shattered on October 17th, 1941. It was a Friday, a day when the air felt heavy with the scent of rain. Philip Peters had returned home, and the house was no longer Theodore's alone. But hunger is a persistent companion. And Theodore, perhaps driven by a lapse in caution or the sheer exhaustion of hiding, ventured down to the kitchen in the dim light of the evening. He stood at the refrigerator, the cold white light spilling onto the linoleum floor, casting a long shadow toward the hallway. He was reaching for a piece of meat when he heard a sound behind him, the sharp tap of wood on wood. Philip Peters, 73 years old and leaning on a sturdy cane, was standing in the doorway. The confrontation was not a cinematic explosion of violence. It was a desperate, clumsy struggle between two men who were both, in their own ways, fragile. Philip, startled by the stranger in his kitchen, struck out with his cane. It was a natural reaction, the defense of a man whose sanctuary had been breached. Theodore reached for an old pistol he had found hidden in the house weeks earlier. He didn't use it to fire. He used it as a club, swinging it with the frantic strength of a trapped animal. The gun was old and brittle, and it broke apart under the force of the struggle. The kitchen, once a place of quiet routine, became a theater of shadows. Theodore grabbed a heavy iron stove shaker, a tool used to clear ash from the furnace, and he struck Philip until the older man moved no more. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic music. There was only the heavy, ragged breathing of a tired man and the sudden, permanent silence of the house. Theodore stood in the kitchen, the iron shaker heavy in his hand, looking down at the man who had once been his acquaintance. He did not flee into the night. He did not run for the door. Instead, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He wiped his hands, moved through the shadows of the hallway, and climbed back into the closet. He pushed open the trap door, pulled himself into the darkness of the eaves, and closed the door behind him. He lay on the rafters, his heart hammering against his ribs, and waited for the world to arrive. When the neighbors became concerned that Philip hadn't shown up for dinner, they called the police. Theodore heard them enter the house. He heard the heavy thud of their boots on the floorboards where he had stood only an hour before. He heard their voices, low and urgent, as they found Philip in the kitchen. The police conducted a thorough search of the house. They checked the basement, the bedrooms, and the closets. They even noted the small trap door in the ceiling of the second-floor closet. They stood directly beneath him, their flashlights casting circles of light on the wood, but they looked at the small dimensions of the opening and decided that no normal-sized man could possibly fit through it. They concluded the killer must have fled through a locked door. They left, and Theodore remained, a secret once again, tucked away in the ribs of the house. For the next 9 months, the house at 3335 West Moncrief Place became a place of whispers and unease. Philip's widow, Mrs. Peters, returned from the hospital where she had been recovering from a broken hip. She was a woman of habit, trying to find her footing in a home that now felt hollow. She lived in the house with a housekeeper, neither of them aware that the man who had ended Philip's life was resting just a few feet above their heads. Theodore continued his nocturnal life, a ghost in the machine. He would wait until the women were deep in sleep or out of the house for errands. Then he would descend. He moved with a predatory grace, stealing small portions of food, a few coins, and the occasional supply. The housekeeper was the first to feel the change in the air. She began to hear things that logic could not explain. Footsteps in the night, light and rhythmic, pacing the hallway when everyone was accounted for. The faint click of a lock turning in the dark. The smell of tobacco smoke in a room where no one had smoked for months. She became convinced that the house was haunted by the spirit of Philip Peters, that he was wandering the halls looking for the peace that had been taken from him. The atmosphere became heavy, a thick blanket of unexplained occurrences that made the simple act of walking to the kitchen feel like an intrusion. Eventually, the housekeeper resigned, unable to bear the feeling of being watched by eyes she could not see. Mrs. Peters, too, felt the weight of the house. She would find her things moved slightly from where she had left them. A chair would be pulled out, a window would be unlatched. She eventually moved to western Colorado to live with her son, leaving the brick house on Moncrief Place vacant. But it wasn't truly vacant. Theodore remained. He had become the house. He knew every creak of the stairs, every groan of the joists. He was no longer a man living in an attic. He was the consciousness of the building itself. He lived in a state of permanent twilight, his skin becoming the color of parchment, his eyes adjusting to the perpetual gloom of the eaves. He was a man who had successfully vanished from the world of the living. It wasn't until July 30th, 1942, that the secret was finally unraveled. The police had continued to make routine checks on the property, perhaps sensing that the story of Philip Peters was not yet finished. During one such visit, a detective named Fred Zarnow heard a lock click on the second floor. It was a small sound, but in a vacant house, it was as loud as a gunshot. He ran up the stairs and caught a fleeting glimpse of a pair of legs disappearing through the ceiling. The police reached up, grabbed the legs, and pulled Theodore Coneys down from his sanctuary. He was thin, his clothes were rags, and he smelled of dust and old wood. Detective Zarnow remarked that a man would have to be a spider to live up there for so long. The press seized on the name, and Theodore became the Spider-Man of Moncrief Place. He confessed to the crime, was sentenced to life, and eventually passed away in the prison hospital in 1967. He finally found the permanent solitude he had sought, leaving the house on Moncrief Place to the silence of history. We move now from the quiet of the attic to a cold December night in 1943. The setting is a tavern near Fort Logan, an Army Air Force installation just southwest of Denver. The air inside the tavern is thick and warm, a stark contrast to the biting Colorado wind outside. You can smell the spilled beer, the heavy scent of tobacco, and the damp wool of coats drying near the heater. It is a place of temporary escape, where soldiers and locals gathered to forget the weight of the war for a few hours. Ann Geist, 27 years old, is there with her friends. She has brought her 3-year-old daughter, Kathleen Ann, along. In the corner of the room, there is a new novelty that has captured everyone's imagination. A pinball machine. Its lights flash in vibrant reds and greens. Its bells ring with a mechanical cheer. And the silver ball bounces against the bumpers with a satisfying clack. For a fateful hour, the machine becomes the center of the world. Anne and her friends are preoccupied with the game, their eyes following the silver ball as it dances across the playfield. They are caught in the rhythm of the machine, the small victories of a high score providing a brief respite from the anxieties of 1943. Also inside the tavern is Staff Sergeant Frank Martz. He is 33, a cook for the Army, recently returned from a furlough in South Dakota. He is a man who spent his life in the transient world of carnivals and circuses before joining the military. He watches the mother play the machine. He watches the little girl, Kathleen, standing alone in the periphery of the light. Martz approaches her and whispers a promise, the kind of promise that sounds like a fairy tale to a 3-year-old. He tells her of soft drinks and a fluffy, stuffed toy rabbit waiting for her at his apartment. The girl, trusting and innocent, takes his hand. They walk out of the tavern and into the cold night. As they move down the street, they pass a patrolman named George Fritzinger. He sees them under the glow of a street lamp and thinks nothing of it. Just a father and daughter walking home in the dark. The tragedy that followed inside Martz's apartment was one of sudden, senseless violence. A dark contrast to the festive lights of the tavern. When Ann Geist finally looked away from the pinball machine and realized her daughter was gone, the search began in earnest. Patrolman Fritzinger remembered the man and the girl. He led military police to Martz's door. They found him drunk, confused, and partially clothed. And then, they found Kathleen. The stuffed rabbit he had promised was nowhere to be found. It was a ghost of a promise used to lure a child into the dark. Frank Martz's defense was as strange as the crime itself. He told the district attorney that he had spent the afternoon reading detective stories in pulp magazines with lurid covers and tales of vampires and blood. He claimed the stories had confused his mind, bleeding into his reality until he couldn't distinguish between the printed word and his own actions. He spoke of a fog of wine and beer, a long interval of lost time where the vampire stories took control of his hands. But the jury in Littleton did not see a man lost in a story. They saw a man who had committed an unforgivable act against the most vulnerable. In February 1944, he was sentenced to die. The pulp magazines he blamed were left behind in his cell, their sensationalist covers fading in the light. The end for Frank Martz came on November 23, 1945. He spent his final days reading a Bible given to him by another inmate, a man who had already faced his own end. When the warden, Roy Best, arrived at his cell to read the death warrant, Martz's face briefly lit up with a flicker of hope. Perhaps a stay of execution had been granted, but as the words were read, his face dropped. The last of his illusions vanishing. He recovered his composure and smiled at his spiritual advisor, Father Justin McKernan. He walked the quarter-mile to the gas chamber on Woodpecker Hill with a steady gait. When a guard reached out to help him, Martz shrugged him off. "I don't need any help," he said. "I can walk by myself." He was a man who had lived in the shadows of the carnival and the barracks, and he chose to walk into the final shadow on his own feet. Inside the chamber, strapped into the chair, Martz held a crucifix in one hand and a St. Christopher medal in the other. St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, a symbol of a safe journey across dangerous waters. He raised the medal to his heart and whispered, "God forgive me, for I have sinned. I'm sorry." At 7:59, the pellets dropped into the acid. By 8:02, the room was silent. His body was cleaned with a chlorine solution, a clinical end to a life of chaos. When no one came to claim him, he was buried in the prison cemetery on Woodpecker Hill, under the same soil where so many secrets of the 1940s are kept. The wind on the hill carries the scent of dry grass and old stone, a quiet resting place for a man who claimed to be haunted by stories. Not every story of the 1940s ended in a gas chamber or hidden attic. Some found their way toward a different kind of resolution. Jim Quillen was a man defined by anger. In 1942, after a wild spree of robberies and kidnappings that spanned the coast, he was sent to Alcatraz, the Rock. He was prisoner number 586. When he arrived, the guards described him as a bitter youth, a man who thought he was a big shot because of the length of his sentence. He was impulsive, his mind always churning with plans for escape. He saw the world as a cage, and the guards as the bars that kept him from the life he felt he deserved. He was a man of sharp edges, much like the rocky island he was confined to. But something shifted in the salt air of the bay. A prison minister, performing a task of quiet compassion, tracked down Jim's mother. He found that she had recently passed away and had been buried in a pauper's grave. The news broke something in Jim, but it also cleared a path. He realized that the life he had been fighting for was gone, and the anger he carried was only a weight that kept him anchored to the stone. He stopped looking for the exit and started looking for a way to be useful. He began working in the prison hospital. He sought training as a radiology technician, learning the delicate art of seeing through the surface of things to the structure beneath. He became a man of science and service within the walls of the most notorious prison in the world. When Jim was finally released and transferred to San Quentin in 1952, he was a certified technician. He lived a roller coaster of a personal life for several years, struggling to adjust to a world that moved faster than the one he had left behind. But eventually, he found stability. He met a woman who saw the man he had become, not the prisoner he had been. They had a daughter, and Jim found the peace of a normal, quiet life. In 1991, he published his memoirs, Alcatraz from the Inside. He remained critical of the system, but his life was proof that even in a place designed to break men, some choose to rebuild themselves instead. He died not as a number, but as a man who had reclaimed his own narrative from the shadows of the rock. In Elwood City, Pennsylvania, there was a man named Jimmy Pasta. He was a man who knew the edges of the law, making his living running illegal numbers games in the back rooms of the city. He called himself a bill collector, a title that carried a certain weight on the streets. He was a man of sharp suits and quick wits. But on September 19th, 1940, Jimmy found himself in the middle of a literal war. He was sitting in his car near the Connoquenessing Creek when he saw the chief of police, Ernest Hartman, stop a black 1939 Buick on the bridge. The men inside the Buick were not ordinary citizens. They were ex-convicts who had just robbed a bank in Harrisville. The chief opened fire with a Tommy gun, the rhythmic chatter of the weapon echoing off the stone of the bridge. An off-duty officer named Ed Schaffer jumped into Jimmy's car and told him to follow the fleeing Buick. Jimmy did as he was told, his hands steady on the wheel as they raced 15 miles out of town. When the robber's car finally ran off the road, Jimmy found himself face to face with desperate, wounded men. He saw one of the robbers, Virgil Evarts, trying to force a passing driver out of their car. Jimmy realized it was now or never. He grabbed a rifle from one of the wounded men and turned it on Evarts. He fired through the window, then climbed down a hill to finish the struggle, hitting Evarts over the head with a gun. He acted with a bravery that surprised even him, ending the threat before the police could arrive. For his heroism, the city gave Jimmy a plaque and a gold Gruen wristwatch. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, a symbol of his transition from the fringes of the law to a local hero. But the watch had a secret of its own. It never ran. Jimmy took it to the best jewelers in Pennsylvania, but they all told him the same thing. The mechanics were perfect. The springs were tight, but it simply wouldn't tick for him. He eventually got rid of the watch, but kept the plaque on his wall. Jimmy Pasta eventually went straight, leaving the numbers games behind to become a sales manager for a furniture store. He became a leader in his community, a man who had once chased down the shadows and decided to stay in the light. He lived to be 75, a testament to the idea that a single moment of courage can change the direction of a life. As we drift closer to sleep, we look at two smaller stories from the era. Stories that remind us of the strange, quiet desperation of the Great Depression. Joe Crow was a prisoner in Oklahoma, a trustee working on a dam project near Fort Towson. One afternoon in 1938, he simply walked away. He borrowed a car, drove across the border to Paris, Texas, and robbed a gas company of $20. Then, in a move that baffled the authorities, He drove back to the dam site and resumed his work as a supervisor over the other inmates. He thought no one would notice a few hours of absence in the vastness of the project. But he was identified by the people he robbed. His unauthorized field trip, ending in a prison mugshot marked with a large X by a newspaper editor. It was a bold, quiet kind of defiance. A man trying to claim a moment of freedom in a world of concrete and iron. Then there was Jake Voland in Shelton, Nebraska. In 1931, the depths of the Depression had driven many to desperate measures. Jake tried to steal chickens from the Stubblefield farm, a modest operation that couldn't afford to lose its livestock. But the Stubblefields had an ingenious defense. A simple mousetrap rigged to a bell in their bedroom. When Jake opened the coop door in the dead of night, the trap snapped, the bell rang, and the silence of the farm was shattered. Jake fled into the night, dropping his loot and leaving his car behind in his haste. He claimed the car had been stolen, but the jury didn't believe the story. He was sentenced to a year in prison for 10 chickens valued at $5. These stories of men like Joe and Jake are the textures of a different time. They are stories of small stakes and strange choices, of mousetraps and dam projects. They remind us that history is not just made of grand battles and political shifts, but of individual lives, each one struggling, each one finding their way through the dark. As the rain continues to fall outside your window, let these names, Crow, Voland, Pasta, become part of the rhythm of the night. They are no longer men of conflict. They are resolved. They are part of the past, their stories told and their secrets kept. The world of the 1940s is settling now, the lights of the taverns and the attics of Denver fading into the quiet of the archive. We have traveled far tonight, from the hidden eaves of a house in Denver to the rocky shores of Alcatraz and the bridges of Pennsylvania. Every secret has been told. Every man we spoke of has found his final resting place. Theodore Coneys has his solitude. Frank Martz has his prayers. Jim Quillen has his peace. The house on Moncrief Place is quiet now, its attic empty, its floorboards still. The world of 1941 has folded back into the pages of history, leaving us here in the safety and the stillness of the present. The loops are closed. The stories have reached their natural end. The rain is still falling outside your window. It is a steady, rhythmic sound that washes away the lingering images of the night, leaving only the dark and the comfort of your room. You have no more questions to answer. You have no more paths to walk. The night is yours, a vast and peaceful territory where you can finally let go. Feel the weight of your body against the bed, safe and secure. You are drifting now, moving away from the words and into the deep, dark quiet of sleep. The world is at rest. The air is cool. The shadows are soft. The story is over. The silence is here. Stay safe. Sleep well. Good night. The silence of the night remains unbroken. We find ourselves moving through the veil of time to a place where the shadows are long and the secrets are held in the very grain of the wood. The architecture of a house is often more than just a collection of brick and mortar. It is a vessel for the stories we leave behind in the corners we forget to clean. Tonight, we settle into the high plains of Colorado, where the Denver wind carries the sharp, clean scent of cedar and the distant promise of a mountain winter. In a modest brick house on West Moncrief Place, a man named Philip Peters lived a life of quiet routine. unaware that the very ceiling above his head held a weight he could never have imagined. The mind seeks order. The night brings peace. We find ourselves standing on a quiet residential street in 1941. The streetlights cast long, amber shadows across the pavement, and the air is thick with the comforting smell of coal smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. You are safe here, tucked away from the noise of the modern world. Let your breath slow. Imagine the weight of a heavy wool blanket settling over your shoulders as the rain begins to tap a gentle, rhythmic code against the glass of the window pane. Every story we explore tonight has already reached its conclusion. Every mystery has been unraveled by the passage of time, and every shadow has been accounted for by the light of morning. We are merely observers now, drifting through the archives of a decade defined by its resilience and its hidden corners, where the past remains preserved in the amber of memory. As you settle deeper into your pillows, feel the stillness of the room around you. The world outside is vast, but here, in this space, the boundaries are soft and secure. The 1940s settle around us like a familiar coat, heavy and warm. It was a time of radio plays and tactile things, of fountain pens and heavy iron stoves. In Denver, the autumn of 1941 was particularly crisp. The leaves had turned to a deep, burnt orange, crunching under the feet of neighbors who waved to one another from their porches. It was a community of locked doors that felt unnecessary, of milk bottles left on the step, and of a shared understanding that the home was a sanctuary. In this collection of resolved histories, we will walk through the quiet halls of that house on Moncrief Place to understand the man who lived in the darkness of the eaves. We will travel to the salt-sprayed rocks of Alcatraz to witness a transformation that began in the depths of isolation. We will stand on a bridge in Pennsylvania, where a man known as a bill collector found a moment of unexpected courage. Each of these paths leads back to the same destination, the restoration of order. There are no loose ends here. There is only the steady, calming pulse of history being recounted. The rain continues its steady work outside, washing away the dust of the day. Inside, the radiator hisses with a rhythmic, metallic sigh, a sound that has echoed through decades of peaceful nights. You may notice the way the light fades at the edges of your vision, turning the room into a sanctuary of soft grays and deep blues. We are traveling back to a world where the pace was slower, where the news arrived on paper and the nights were truly dark. In that darkness, we find not fear, but the quiet truth of human experience. Let the weight of your limbs become heavy. The stories we tell tonight are anchored in fact, verified by the ledgers of the past, and closed by the hand of justice. There is a profound safety in knowing how the story ends before it even begins. As we step onto the porch of the house at 3335 West Moncrief Place, the door is unlocked, the air inside is still, and the secrets are waiting to be gently revealed. The journey is starting, but you are already home. The silence is a companion, and the history is a lullaby. We begin in the shadows of the attic, where a man made of porcelain and persistence was about to become a ghost in his own time. Solitude is often a choice. For some, it is a sanctuary. The landscape of central Illinois in 1882 was a study in flat gray horizons. In the small town of Petersburg, a child named Theodore Coneys was born into a family that understood the weight of iron and the permanence of cold steel. His father, a Canadian immigrant, worked daily among the heavy, metallic scents of a hardware store. Theodore was different. While other children ran through the tall grass of the prairies, Theodore's breath came in shallow, ragged pulls that left him trailing behind the rhythm of the world. The loss of his father in 1888 stripped away the remaining sturdy edges of his childhood, leaving him and his mother to navigate a life that felt increasingly fragile and temporary. By the time they reached Wisconsin, the boy's identity was already fused with a medical prognosis that acted as a ticking clock, a quiet promise from doctors that his heart would fail before his 18th year. A man told he is dying learns to watch the world from the periphery. He becomes an observer of the mundane, noticing the way the light catches the dust motes in a room, or the specific, rhythmic scratching of a pen across a ledger. Theodore did not finish high school. He was a boy living on borrowed time, and the classroom felt like a luxury he could not afford. Instead, he became a man of numbers and ink. He moved with his mother to Denver in 1907, a journey taken in the hope that the thin, dry air of the mile-high city would act as a balm for his struggling lungs. They found a small life there. His mother found work as a housekeeper at the Denver Democratic Club, a place of polished wood and political whispers, while Theodore secured a position as a bookkeeper at the Denver Brass Works. But the air did not bring the cure he had been promised. Theodore remained a man of porcelain, his frame never filling out, his skin retaining a translucent quality that seemed to invite the pity of strangers. He deeply resented that pity. To be seen as weak is to be judged, and Theodore craved a life where he was invisible, free from the exhaustion of being a medical curiosity or a social burden. When his mother passed away in 1911, the last anchor holding him to a traditional life was severed. He drifted through the following decades, like a leaf caught in a slow-moving current. He worked in advertising and sales, professions that required a performance he found increasingly difficult to maintain. By the autumn of 1941, the world was changing. The distant drums of war were growing louder, and the streets of Denver were filled with the energy of a nation preparing for a great struggle. Theodore, however, was moving in the opposite direction. He was 59 years old, a man who had outlived his own death sentence by 40 years. But he had nothing left to show for the reprieve. He was homeless, his clothes were thinning at the elbows, and the mountain nights were beginning to carry the sharp, biting edge of the coming winter. He remembered a name from his past, a man named Philip Peters, who lived on West Moncrief Place. Philip was a man of substance, a man with a house that promised warmth and perhaps a moment of recognition. Theodore walked toward that house in September, his footsteps light and hesitant on the pavement. He did not arrive with a plan for violence or a desire for confrontation. He was simply a man looking for a handout, a bit of bread, or a place to rest his head away from the wind. When he reached the modest brick home at number 3335, he found the windows dark and the porch empty. Philip Peters was away. Theodore tried the door, and to his surprise, the latch gave way with a soft, welcoming click. He stepped inside, the smell of cedar and old floor wax rising to meet him. In the stillness of that empty house, Theodore did not see a place to rob. He saw a place to disappear. He began to move through the rooms, his boots silent. looking for a corner where the world could finally forget he existed. He moved toward the back of the house, guided by the dim light filtering through the heavy drapes. The air was still. He looked toward the ceiling and noticed a small, recessed panel. It was a trap door, a modest square of wood that seemed to invite a man of his slight stature to leave the world behind. He pushed the panel upward with the palms of his trembling hands. The wood moved. Inside the darkness above, the temperature dropped, and the scent of old, dry insulation rose to greet him, like a forgotten memory. He hoisted his frail frame into the opening, feeling the rough texture of the joists against his palms, and the weight of the house settling around him. The space was no more than a cubbyhole, a narrow stretch of shadows beneath the steep pitch of the roof where the rafters met the floor. Theodore pulled the trapdoors shut, and for the first time in many years, he felt the heavy mantle of the world lift from his shoulders. He lay back against the wooden slats, his breath coming in shallow, rhythmic sighs that eventually synced with the quiet ticking of a clock somewhere far below. The attic was a world of gray and silver, where the only illumination came from the thin, needle-like rays of sun that pierced through the cracks in the roof shingles. These beams of light were filled with dancing motes of dust, turning the cramped space into a cathedral of the mundane. The ceiling was so low that he could not stand. But for a man who had spent his life trying to shrink away from the gaze of others, the restriction felt like a protective embrace. For 5 weeks, the house on Moncrief Place was his alone. Philip Peters was away, leaving the rooms downstairs silent and expectant. Theodore became a creature of the house's internal clock, learning the language of its creaks and the deep, resonant hum of the furnace in the basement. He discovered that the house breathed just as he did, expanding in the warmth of the afternoon and contracting as the cold Denver nights set in. He would wait until the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood into a soft, blue twilight, before he allowed himself to descend from his sanctuary. His movements were governed by a profound, cautious grace. He learned which floorboards remained silent and which ones would announce a footfall with a sharp, wooden protest. When he reached the kitchen, the linoleum felt cool against his feet, a stark contrast to the rough timber of his attic lair. He did not feast. He merely sustained. A single crust of bread was taken from the larder, the missing piece so small that it seemed more like a trick of the light than a theft. He would find a jar of strawberry jam and take a single, careful spoonful, smoothing the surface afterward so the level remained unchanged. The water from the kitchen tap was crisp and metallic, and he would let it run in a thin, silent stream. Catching the liquid in a glass, he would later wash and dry with obsessive care. During the long, slow hours of the day, Theodore would return to the attic with yesterday's newspaper tucked under his arm. He would lie on his side, the newsprint rustling softly as he read about the movements of a world that felt increasingly distant. He read about the rising tensions in Europe and the busy lives of people in downtown Denver. But these stories felt like dispatches from a different planet. In the attic, there was no war, no poverty, and no judgment. There was only the scent of cedar from the closet below and the occasional, muffled sound of a car passing on the street outside. He found a strange, parasitic peace in this arrangement. By living in the gaps of another man's life, he had found a way to exist without the burden of being seen. He was a secret kept by the architecture, a shadow that moved when the house was empty and stilled when the world grew loud. He began to feel a sense of ownership over the silence, as if he were the true guardian of the home's quietude. The dust on the rafters became familiar to him, each layer representing a day of safety and solitude. He would trace the grain of the wood with his fingertips, finding comfort in the solid, unchanging nature of the beams. The plumbing was perhaps the most intimate connection he had to the house. When the pipes rattled, he knew the water was moving through the walls, a hidden circulatory system that mirrored his own presence. He would press his ear to the plaster and listen to the gurgle and flow, a mechanical heartbeat that reassured him he was not alone, yet remained entirely hidden. The attic was not a prison to him. It was a cocoon. It was a place where the fragility of his body didn't matter, where the doctor's predictions of an early death were proven wrong by every steady, quiet breath he took in the dark. As the weeks turned into a month, Theodore's senses sharpened. He could tell the time of day by the angle of the light through the shingles and the specific temperature of the air against his skin. He knew when the neighborhood children were walking home from school by the rhythmic patter of their feet on the sidewalk. And he knew when the evening mail had arrived by the faint clatter of the metal slot. He was a silent observer of a life he no longer had to lead. He was safe. He was warm. He was, for the first time in his 59 years, exactly where he wanted to be. The world outside continued its frantic pace, but inside the eaves of 3335 West Moncrief Place, time had slowed to a crawl, measured only by the settling of dust and the slow, inevitable approach of winter. The Friday of October 17th, 1941, arrived with a particular chill that seemed to seep through the brickwork of the Moncrief Place house, a subtle reminder that the golden light of autumn was beginning to fade into the gray steel of a Denver winter. Inside the house, the atmosphere was one of practiced stillness, a quietude that Theodore Coneys had come to rely upon as he moved through the shadows of the eaves. He'd spent 5 weeks becoming a part of the architecture, learning the exact location of every creaking board and the precise moment when the afternoon sunlight would hit the kitchen floor. But hunger is a persistent companion, an anchor that eventually pulls even the most careful ghost back toward the world of the living. Theodore, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by the weeks of silence, chose this afternoon to descend from his sanctuary. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice. The trapdoor in the closet ceiling opened with a faint, dry sigh of wood against wood. Theodore lowered himself into the cedar-scented darkness of the closet and stepped out into the hallway. The house felt different that day. There was a weight to the air, a sense that the routine had shifted. Philip Peters, 73 years old, and a man of unwavering habits, was home. He had been out for a time, but the rhythm of his return had slipped past Theodore's notice. Theodore reached the kitchen, his eyes drawn to the white enamel of the refrigerator. It was a modern comfort, a humming box that held the promise of a cold glass of milk or a piece of leftover meat. As he opened the door, the small internal light spilled out across the linoleum, casting a long, thin shadow behind him. It was in this pool of artificial light that the two men finally met. Philip Peters stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway. He was a man of dignity and age, leaning on a sturdy wooden cane that had supported him through years of quiet walks. The surprise was absolute. For Philip, it was the impossible sight of a stranger, thin and pale as a specter, standing in his private sanctuary. For Theodore, it was the sudden, violent end of his invisibility. Philip did not hesitate. He raised his cane, the polished wood catching the light, and struck out at the intruder. It was a natural reaction, a defense of the home he had built and maintained. Theodore reached for a heavy object he had found weeks earlier, an old discarded pistol. He did not use it to fire. He used it as a club, swinging it with the desperate strength of a man who feared the light more than he feared death. Under the force of the collision, the old gun shattered, the metal and wood splintering against the reality of the struggle. The two men moved through the kitchen in a clumsy, tragic dance. There was no shouting, only the heavy, labored breathing of two souls caught in a moment of senseless friction. Theodore's hand found the iron stove shaker, a tool used to clear the heavy ash from the belly of the furnace. It was a cold, primitive piece of iron, weighted for labor. In the dimness of the kitchen, the struggle reached its final, silent conclusion. The violence was not cinematic. It was a heavy, dull series of events that left the house more silent than it had ever been. Philip Peters lay on the floor of his kitchen, and the ticking of the clock in the hallway became the only sound in the room. Theodore did not panic in the way a man of the world might. He did not run for the door or seek the safety of the street. Instead, he retreated into the only world he still understood. He wiped the iron shaker and placed it back near the stove. He moved through the house with a haunting efficiency, ensuring that the doors were locked and the windows were latched from the inside. He returned to the closet, reached up for the trap door, and pulled himself back into the darkness of the eaves. He settled onto the dusty rafters, his heart hammering against his ribs, and waited for the world to notice the silence he had created. It did not take long. A neighbor, concerned that Philip had not arrived for a scheduled dinner, called the police later that evening. Theodore listened from above as the authorities arrived. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of police boots on the floorboards, where he had stood only an hour before. He heard the sharp intake of breath when they found Philip. The detectives moved through the house with flashlights, their beams cutting through the shadows and dancing across the ceiling. They stood in the very closet where the trapdoor was hidden. They looked up and saw the small square of wood in the ceiling. One of the officers noted the dimensions, shaking his head. He remarked that no normal-sized man could possibly fit through such a small opening. They assumed the killer had fled through a door that had somehow locked itself behind him. They left the house to the darkness, unaware that the secret was still breathing just inches above their heads. Theodore remained in the eaves, a shadow once more, as the first snow began to fall outside. Mrs. Peters returned to the house in a wheelchair. The hospital had finally released her. She moved through the rooms with a new, fragile caution, her hip still mending from the break. Above her, in the suffocating heat of the crawl space, Theodore adjusted his weight on the rafters, feeling the vibration of her movements through the lath and plaster. He had become a master of the house's internal anatomy, knowing exactly which boards would groan and which would remain silent. A housekeeper was hired to assist with the daily chores. Together, the two women established a routine of tea and radio broadcasts, the soft hum of the vacuum cleaner providing a mask for Theodore's own careful shifts in the darkness. He would wait for the sun to dip below the horizon, watching the amber light fade from the attic vents, before he dared to lower himself into the cedar-scented closet to begin his nightly scavenge. The smell of the house changed during those months, shifting from the metallic tang of the furnace to the domestic scents of lavender soap, fried onions, and the lingering aroma of the housekeeper's morning coffee. But the silence was never truly empty. The housekeeper began to notice the small things first, the tiny discrepancies that a busy mind might overlook, but a quiet house amplifies. A spoon moved from one side of the drawer to the other. The faint, stale scent of tobacco lingered in a guest room where no one had smoked for years. She heard footsteps that seemed to mirror her own, a rhythmic double tap on the floorboards that suggested a second occupant was pacing the house in tandem with her chores. Imagine the stillness of a kitchen at midnight, where the only sound should be the hum of the refrigerator, suddenly broken by the soft, deliberate click of a lock. The housekeeper became convinced that the spirit of Philip Peters had remained behind, unable to leave the home he had built. This belief grew into a heavy, suffocating fear that eventually led her to resign, leaving Mrs. Peters alone with the shadows and the unexplained creaks of the night. The widow, too, eventually found the atmosphere of the house on Moncrief Place to be too much to bear. The memories of her husband were now entangled with a sense of being watched, a parasitic presence that drained the comfort from the familiar brick walls. She packed her trunks and moved to the western slope of Colorado to live with her son, leaving the house to stand vacant. For Theodore, this was a period of strange, lonely triumph. He was no longer a guest in the shadows. He was the master of a hollow kingdom. He could walk the hallways in the dim light of the afternoon, reading the newspapers left behind and listening to the wind whistle through the eaves. He had become the house itself, a living part of the architecture, surviving on the scraps of a life he had unmade. It was the sound of a lock that finally broke the spell on July 30th, 1942. Detectives had returned for a routine check of the property, their heavy boots echoing in the vacant hallways with a finality that the house hadn't known for months. As they moved through the second floor, a single sharp click resonated from the direction of the closet. Detective Fred Zarnow didn't hesitate. He ran toward the sound and caught a fleeting glimpse of a pair of thin, pale legs disappearing into the ceiling. They reached up and grabbed the ankles, pulling the secret out of the rafters and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the bedroom. Theodore Coneys emerged not as a monster, but as a remnant of a man. His skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and brittle from nearly a year without the touch of the sun, and his clothes were little more than gray rags held together by grime. The press would later call him the Spider-Man of Denver, a name born from a detective's remark that only a spider could have endured such a cramped and dusty existence for so long. Theodore confessed to the crime, his voice a dry rasp after months of whispers. He was sentenced to life at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City, a place where the walls were made of stone rather than lath and plaster. He spent his remaining years in the prison hospital, a quiet man who finally found the permanent solitude he had sought since his youth. When he passed away in 1967, the secrets of the house on Moncrief Place were finally laid to rest, and the attic returned to the dust and the silence of the past. As the memory of the Spider-Man fades into the archives, we move away from the brick houses of Denver and toward a different kind of darkness. The winter of 1943 brought a biting chill to the plains of Colorado, where the lights of Fort Logan flickered against a backdrop of global uncertainty. It was a time when the world felt both crowded and profoundly lonely, a season defined by heavy wool coats and the constant low hum of military preparation. On the evening of December 6th, the air outside was a sharp, crystalline cold that made the warmth of a local tavern feel like a sanctuary. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the comforting smells of toasted hops, pipe tobacco, and the damp cedar of the floorboards. Anne Geist, a woman of 27 years, stood among her friends, her face illuminated by the rhythmic flashing of a new mechanical wonder. The pinball machine was a novelty in those days, a bright altar of glass and electricity that promised a momentary escape from the weight of the era. Anne watched the silver ball dance against the bumpers, her fingers resting on the wooden frame as she felt the vibration of every point scored. The bells rang with a sharp, clear resonance that cut through the low murmur of conversation, drawing the eyes of everyone in the room toward the shifting lights. In that concentrated focus, the world beyond the machine's cabinet seemed to blur and recede. Her 3-year-old daughter, Kathleen Ann, stood nearby, a small figure in a room built for adults, watching the flashing colors with a quiet, wandering curiosity. In a booth not far away sat Staff Sergeant Frank Martz, a 33-year-old Army cook who had recently returned from a visit with his wife in South Dakota. He was a man accustomed to the structured rhythms of the mess hall. Yet that night, he was adrift in the amber glow of the tavern. He watched the mother's intense focus on the game, and then turned his gaze to the little girl who stood momentarily forgotten in the peripheral shadows. Martz stood up, his heavy boots silent on the sawdust-covered floor, and approached the child with a soft-spoken promise. He spoke of a fluffy, stuffed toy rabbit waiting in his nearby apartment, a magical object that existed in the bright, soft world of childhood dreams. Kathleen took his hand, her small palm resting against the rough wool of his uniform. They stepped out of the tavern and into the velvet darkness of the Colorado night, where the stars hung like frozen sparks over the silent hangars. As they walked along the quiet street, they passed Patrolman George Fritzinger, who was making his rounds through the biting wind. He saw the tall man and the small girl and felt a sense of domestic peace, assuming he was witnessing a father leading his daughter home after a long day. The image was so mundane, so inherently safe, that he offered a polite nod and continued his walk, his own footsteps echoing against the frost-covered pavement. Back inside the tavern, the pinball game eventually came to its inevitable conclusion, the silver ball dropping into the darkness of the machine with a final, hollow thud. Anne Geist looked up, the spell of the lights broken, and called out for her daughter. The silence that met her was the beginning of a different kind of story, one that would strip away the comfort of the night The frantic search began under the glow of street lamps and flashlights, a desperate weaving through the alleys and side streets. It was Patrolman Fritzinger who provided the first link, remembering the man and the girl he had seen earlier in the evening. The path led directly to the door of Frank Martz's apartment, where the air was heavy with the scent of stale wine and the oppressive stillness of a secret kept. When the military police forced their way inside, they found Martz in a state of disoriented intoxication, his clothing disheveled and his eyes clouded. The search of the small, cramped rooms eventually led to the space beneath the kitchen sink, a dark and utilitarian corner where the plumbing met the floor. There, the searchers found the small, broken form of Kathleen Ann, hidden away from the world. The promised stuffed rabbit, the lure that had brought her there, was nowhere to be found, leaving only the cold reality of a night that had turned from a game into a tragedy. The quiet of the apartment was soon filled with the arrival of investigators. And as the news of the discovery spread, the tavern's pinball machine stood dark and silent, its bells no longer ringing. The interrogation began in the early hours, under the hum of an electric light that seemed to pulse with the tension of the room. District Attorney Richard Simon sat across from the soldier, listening to a narrative that defied the logic of the law. Martz claimed that his actions were not entirely his own, but were fueled by the dark fantasies he had consumed earlier that day. He spoke of pulp magazines. He described the lurid covers and the scent of cheap, acidic ink that filled his apartment on that December afternoon. He had spent his time immersed in those cheaply printed journals of shadow and sin that were common in the 1940s. One story in particular had taken root in his mind, a tale of a vampire, a creature that sought the lifeblood of the living. He argued that the combination of these macabre stories and a heavy intake of wine and beer had created a fog in his consciousness, a place where the boundaries of the world had simply dissolved. Coroner Evan J. Foss noted the physical evidence that contradicted any notion of a dreamlike state. But the defense held firm to the idea of a mind led astray by fiction. The jury in Littleton, however, remained unmoved by the suggestion that a magazine could absolve a man of such gravity. In February 1944, the legal proceedings reached their inevitable conclusion, and the sentence of death was handed down. The following months were a slow passage of time, marked by the steady ticking of a clock in a cell and the quiet rustle of pages. Martz spent his final days reading a Bible, a gift from a fellow inmate named Charles Ford Stillman, who had walked the same path to the chamber only weeks before. This book, worn at the edges and smelling of old parchment, became his only companion as the state of Colorado prepared for the final resolution. On the evening of November 23, 1945, a final sanity hearing was convened to ensure that the man the state was about to execute understood the nature of his fate. It was a formality of the era, a quiet gathering of officials in the shadow of the coming night. When Warden Roy Best entered the cell, there was a fleeting moment where Martz's eyes brightened, perhaps hoping for a stay of execution or a last-minute reprieve. But as the warden began to read the death warrant, that light vanished, replaced by a somber acceptance. Martz turned to his spiritual advisor, Father Justin McKernan, and offered a small, sad smile. He was ready to begin the quarter-mile walk to Woodpecker Hill, the site of the prison's gas chamber. The air on the hill was crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and the distant, cold breath of the mountains. Martz walked with a steady, unhurried gait, his movements calm and deliberate. When a guard reached out to steady him, Martz gently declined the assistance, stating that he could walk by himself. He was a man who had finally stepped out of the fog of his own making and into the sharp clarity of the end. He asked the Father to pray for him, his voice low and steady in the quiet night air. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was clinical and still, a sharp contrast to the chaotic tavern where the story had begun. As the guards secured the straps, Martz held two objects in his hands, a crucifix and a St. Christopher medal. The medal, a symbol of the patron saint of travelers, was held tightly against his heart as a plea for a safe journey into the unknown. He whispered a final apology, a quiet admission of his sins that was lost to the closing of the heavy door. At 7:59, the silent mechanics of the chamber were engaged. By 8:02, the room was once again a place of perfect stillness. His body was later cleaned with a chlorine solution, a final act of sterilization before he was laid to rest in the prison cemetery. No one came to claim him, and so he remained on Woodpecker Hill, buried beneath the quiet Colorado soil, where the stories of the pulp magazines could no longer reach him, while the soil of Colorado holds the quiet remains of those who could not find their way back. We turn our gaze westward, across the vast, sleeping plains, and over the jagged spine of the mountains, to where the land finally meets the cold, churning waters of the Pacific. There, in the center of the San Francisco Bay, sits a tooth of sandstone and concrete known as the Rock. Alcatraz was a place designed to be the end of the line, a destination for those the system deemed unreachable. It was here, on August 28, 1942, that a young man named Jim Quillen arrived to begin a sentence that felt as heavy as the island itself. He was 34 years old, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of a much older man. To the guards and the administrators who processed his arrival, he was simply prisoner number 586. He was a man of sharp edges and quick tempers, a bitter youth who viewed the world through a lens of deep-seated resentment. The air on Alcatraz is different from the dry, thin air of the mountain states. It is thick with salt, a damp, heavy mist that clings to the skin and slowly rusts the very bars meant to hold a man in place. Jim spent his first months in a state of quiet war with his surroundings. He was a man who dreamed of exits, whose mind was a constant map of possibilities and escape routes. He had already slipped the bonds of San Quentin once before, a feat of daring that had earned him his place on this isolated outcrop. In the eyes of the wardens, he was a big shot, a title given to those who believed their own will was stronger than the walls surrounding them. But the walls of Alcatraz were not just made of stone. They were made of the freezing, unpredictable currents of the bay and the constant, rhythmic surveillance of men who never looked away. The shift in Jim's spirit did not come from a grand gesture or a sudden revelation. It began with a letter and a search. A prison minister, a man who moved through the cell blocks with a quiet, unassuming grace, took it upon himself to track down Jim's mother. Jim had grown up in the gaps between people, never truly knowing the woman who had brought him into the world. He carried a hollow space inside him where that connection should have been. A void he had tried to fill with the adrenaline of robbery and the noise of a criminal life. When the minister finally returned with news, it was not the reunion Jim might have secretly hoped for. His mother had passed away, alone and forgotten, and had been laid to rest in a pauper's grave. How does a man react when the last bridge to his past is burned? For Jim, the finality of that news acted as a different kind of sentence. It was as if the last anchor holding him to his old bitter self had been cut loose in the dark. He realized that if he were to die on the rock, his own story would end just as anonymously. A mere footnote in a ledger of forgotten men. He stopped looking for the exit in the walls and started looking for the exit within himself. In the wake of that grief, Jim began to look at the prison hospital not as a place of weakness, but as a place of order. He sought work there, moving away from the yard and the whispered plans of the other inmates. He was drawn to the radiology department, a quiet wing of the facility where the chaos of the prison was replaced by the steady, humming precision of science. He began to train as a radiology technician, a role that required a steady hand and a focused mind. There is a strange, meditative quality to the work of an X-ray technician. You are tasked with seeing through the surface, past the muscle and the skin, to the structural truth of what lies beneath. Imagine the sensory details of that hospital ward in the mid-1940s. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax, the cool touch of the glass plates, the specific metallic hum of the X-ray machine as it warmed up, a sound that cut through the heavy silence of the island. In the darkness of the developing room, surrounded by the scent of chemicals and the dim, comforting glow of the red light, Jim began to develop a new version of himself. He was no longer a number. He was a man of skill, a man who contributed to the healing of others, even within the confines of a cage. The years passed with a different rhythm now. He watched the fog roll in from the Golden Gate, obscuring the distant, glittering lights of San Francisco. He stayed out of the 1946 escape attempt, a violent and desperate affair that left several inmates and guards dead. He saw the futility of the struggle and chose instead the quiet path of self-improvement. By the time he was transferred back to San Quentin in 1952, he was no longer the impulsive youth who had arrived a decade earlier. He was a certified technician, a man with a trade and a sense of purpose. His journey after release was not a simple one. The transition to the outside world is often a roller coaster of adjustments, and Jim's personal life saw many peaks and valleys as he learned to navigate a society that had moved on without him. But he eventually found the stability he had lacked. He found a wife who saw the man he had become rather than the prisoner he had been. He became a father, building a life that was the quiet antithesis of his years of kidnapping and crime. In 1991, as the sun began to set on his own long journey, Jim published his memoirs, titled Alcatraz from the Inside. He remained a critic of the system until the end, describing the rock as a place designed to degrade and break the human spirit. Yet, despite his harsh words for the institution, his own life stood as a testament to the opposite. He had not been broken. He had been refined. He died not as a prisoner, but as a man who had successfully reclaimed his own narrative. As the salt-sprayed cliffs of the island fade into the mist of history, We carry with us the image of a man who found his redemption in the quiet glow of a hospital ward, proving that even in the harshest of environments, the human heart can find a way to mend. The fog remains, and the waves still lap against the sandstone. But the anger of prisoner 586 has long since been washed away.